Okay. Welcome all to the second panel of the second day. My name is Ahmet Kuyaş, and I will introduce the panelists of this panel number 6. There are Dr. Engin Kılıç on my left, and then Mr. Talat Ulusoy. Unfortunately, we have a small change in our program. I have just learned that Professor Baki Tezcan is suffering from COVID-19, so he will join us via Zoom, and well, that must constitute a huge problem. And I will introduce the panelists, each panelist, before their intervention. So our first panelist is Dr. Engin Kılıç, who is a graduate of Boğaziçi University's Department of Turkish Language and Literature. And then he received a master's degree from the Cultural Studies program at Bilgi University. He holds a PhD degree from Leiden University's Turkish Studies program. Nowadays, he teaches Turkish literature, Turkish for foreigners, and Ottoman Turkish literary history at Sabancı University. His research interests include late 19th and early 20th century Turkish literature and literary history. His special focus is on Turkish utopian literature, and of course, he's a specialist of the relationship between Turkish literature and politics. Today, he will tell us about the Turkish novels on the Armistice period, or if you prefer, the occupation period. The floor is yours, Engin.
Çok teşekkürler Ahmet Hocam. Açtım galiba. Efendim merhabalar.
Good afternoon. I will be the first speaker right after the lunch in the spring session. I hope I will not be boring you in this presentation. I'm sure you're all familiar to this photograph. You see British officers on the top of Galata Tower. At the time, there was no cone on top of Galata Tower. So the Allied forces, occupying Allied forces, British military officers on top of Galata Tower. Yes, I will be talking about Turkish novel and the occupation of Istanbul, and how occupation was reflected in Turkish novel of the time. Balkan Wars was my starting point, because both Balkan Wars and also the occupation of Istanbul, they were both the darkest moments of Turkish history, because there is a state which lost its territory, and then European powers make an agreement among themselves, and they come to your capital and they occupy your capital. And likewise, during the Balkan Wars, Ottoman Empire was also defeated by some forces, by some countries that the empire saw them as inferiors, as wild, or used some other derogatory words. So Ottomans indeed were defeated by communities that the empire saw as inferior, and this was a very big shock. It was totally unexpected. And then there was also this feeling that we are now very close to the end, because for the past 2 centuries, the empire kept losing lands and territories, and now there was this feeling of being on the verge. When we look into the literature, we can't really see a very strong reflection of this period in the reflection. You will only find 1 or 2 novels with very short coverage of occupation of Istanbul. There are very few stories. There is one researcher who made a research about 60 short stories, some poems, but that's all. And this was indeed a very important war. First World War, very important, loss of territory, quite a traumatic experience, but it's not really covered in the literature, in the novels. And it's not even properly covered in other domains too. For instance, I keep asking my students at the university about Balkan Wars, but they seem to know nothing. They only know about the very boring provisions of the agreement that ended the war, but no one really knows what was the reason for the Balkan Wars and what was the outcome of the war. Why do you think is this case? Why don't we really know about the Balkan Wars? Why are we not familiar with the wars? I mean, let me ask this question to you, because it's always the audience asking panelist questions. We don't really talk about Balkan Wars because we were defeated. So yes, there may be a psychological barrier here. Interpreters need microphone in order to interpret the contribution of the audience. Thank you very much for your contribution, by the way. I would like to thank the audience. So, when we look back in the past, what would a nation would take pride in? Let's say we found penicillin or we invented this or that. Well, for a culture as such, we mostly take pride in victories, in triumphs, and the Balkan War, because of the defeat, is a source of shame for us. So this is an inexplicable defeat for the Ottoman Empire. And because this has been very much suppressed, it is not really covered in the Turkish novel, but we all know about the theory of Freud. I mean, if you keep on suppressing things, it will not disappear. I mean, it will be for sure coming back. We can also discuss the role of the trauma that came along with the defeat in the Balkan Wars, and particularly the defeat's role in the genocide, as well as the foundation of the Republic. Then we should also talk about the occupation of Istanbul. Here on the screen you see the names of Turkish novels. You may not be able to read them all, but I just wanted to show you this list. These are the Turkish novels which take place in the city of Istanbul. But it's also possible to add more novels to this list, if we are to also include the ones that also mention wartime Istanbul. I also forgot to mention this point about the Balkan Wars. This will be an example from popular culture. Hababam Sınıfı, the Turkish film series. During a history lesson, there is the principal, Kel Mahmud. He would ask students about Balkan Wars, but there is also an inspector in the room, and because none of the students could answer about Balkan War, the inspector feels really angry. But then when principal asks them to cite the national anthem. Everyone stands up, cites the anthem in tears. So this is something that we take pride in, but we don't really talk about Balkan Wars. And how can we explain this phenomenon? Of course, it will be quite problematic to make a general assessment on this. But we also need to remember that there are lots of things happening in Anatolia.
Ve niye elverişli? Milli kimlik inşasına çok elverişli. Orada Anadolu'daki direnişi, örgütlenen direnişi de hesaba katıyor.
So we need to also take into account what's happening in Anatolia, the resistance movement in Anatolia. Of course, it has its positive aspects, negative aspects, but it was not the case in the Balkan Wars. During the Balkan Wars, there was no way out. However, during the First World War, depending on your ethnicity or denomination, you may have different ways of seeing or perceiving what was happening at that time. Perhaps that was a war that one can use to take pride in the homogenization of a multi-ethnic society. For others, it may be a debate around religion versus secularity. So there may be different ways of discussing and perceiving the First World War and its impact on Turkey. But there is yet another then there is another important aspect. This is how Jeffrey Alexander defines cultural trauma. Cultural trauma is a concept that occurs when members of a collectivity feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. However, we need a social mediation. In other words, we need certain social actors to build a narrative around that. Be it power holders, other actors, so we need to look into how these power holders or those in power achieve this coming to terms with cultural trauma. Only when an event is considered to be an existential threat, then it is considered a cultural trauma, and then there comes a resulting narrative, and according to Jeffrey Alexander, these are the carriers of this trauma, and then they try to make sense out of this trauma, and in this way they reinvent a new narrative. So we may also consider that cultural trauma is quite functional in terms of identity building or national identity building. We have very limited time, so I will not be able to read out excerpts from all the Turkish novels of the time. It was a very nice coincidence. After the end of his presentation, Savas Tiselinis talked about Sodom and Gomorrah, and now I would like to tell you more about this novel. This was not planned, by the way. Sodom and Gomorrah. It is an utterly awful novel. I wouldn't recommend this to anyone. If possible, please do not read it. Life is really short to read this novel. It was published in 1928 by Yakup Kadri Kara Osmanoğlu. I mean, the name is self-evident. It refers to Sodom and Gomorrah in the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, it is referred to as Sodom and Gomorrah, but the novel is entitled Sodom and Gomorrah. So Yakup Kadri Karaosmanoğlu really likes this allegory in the Old Testament, and he likes the idea of using this as an analogy to tell us more about Istanbul under occupation. The novel takes place between 1920 to 23. The main characters, the protagonist is Leyla and Necdet. Leyla is not the most convenient character. Where do you think she lives? She lives in Nişantaşı. A new, modern building. That's where she lives. And Sami Bey is an antagonist. And he's retired from where? Do we have any guesses? Of course, do you know Mumiye? His father, Leyla's father, is a retiree of Do You Know Mumiye? Also serving for the French interests. And Yakup Kadri really likes the idea. We can also see it in another novel. Servet Bey was also a retiree from Do You Know Mumiye? Then we have the protagonist Necdet. Necdet is a cousin of Leyla, but also a fiancé. Necdet is in love with Leyla. I mean, in fact, Yakup Kadri contemplated Necdet as a protagonist, but in fact, this is not a good character. Because Necdet somehow condemns moral degradation, but on the other hand, he ends up in all parties. So he didn't really need to go to all these parties when he was critical. And he's also angry at Leyla because Leyla is flirting with British officers, and Leyla is Necdet's fiancé, so Necdet gets really angry with Leyla but cannot really do much about it. And Leyla flirts very frequently with British officer Reed. Reed is very handsome. Everyone is chasing Reed, but Reed is in love with Leyla, so there is this romance in the novel. Then there is Major Will. And the novel says that he has this animal instinct. That's why he actually came to Istanbul. So he doesn't know any boundaries when it comes to sex. Of course, there is certain Orientalism. He has this idea of Orient in his mind, Major Will. And then there is also a British officer, Marlowe. And there is also hatred. And hatred is something that is encouraged post-Balkan Wars. So there are two buttons for inciting hatred that will automatically help you get the reaction. One is labeling people as enemies or gavurs or infidels. And you can easily incite hatred by attacking religious values through blasphemy, or by attacking national values too. So Marlowe is another British officer. He likes Turkey and he's interested in Turkey. He learned the language in Oxford in Oriental Studies, and he is gay, by the way. So yet another button that would incite hatred. There are some women characters in the novel. Jimson with a Levantine father. Azize is a young student at American college. Fenimore is a journalist. Nermin is the only good character in the novel. She travels back and forth between Istanbul and Ankara, but without a significant role in the novel. I would like to tell you about theologic historiography. What do I mean by that? we assume that history progresses on a linear way. We assume that history follows a linear form, and this is what happened in the past, what happens now, and this is what's going to happen in the future. So we perceive it on a linear basis. But when we look into what happened in 1915, we see crossroads. We see a juncture. There are so many factors coming together. One needs to make very difficult choices, and people who make a certain choice can be labeled as traitors. And you can clearly see that in this novel. And it's quite essentially defining. I mean, if you can be either a traitor or a hero. So this novel is a racist one, I have to say, because the author himself is racist, and it includes some racist elements. So I will be reading out some excerpts from the book. Nejdet, the character, he hates the British. He does hate the British. He names them as an inferior race and blames Layla for flirting with an inferior race. And we can also see a lot of anti-Semitic narratives in the novel. For instance, there is a note about a Jewish family who are trying to make clowns out of themselves to please people. So this is another excerpt from the book where the author talks about a German Jewish officer, and just the sheer use of the word Jewish is in a way a swear word for the author. Here is another excerpt which talks about an American girl, but defining her as pure blood American girl. And then, of course, the novel characters talk about Armenians. There is an Armenian girl in the college, a foolish, rude girl. Everyone makes fun of her. Yet another excerpt from the novel. This is a rather long excerpt. At Maxim Bar, Leyla sees a man. And for sure, the man that Leyla is together with is an Armenian. And he understands his Armenian identity because of his glasses, his colorful glasses, and his face. This Armenian man always full of intrigues and in touch, in unison and in touch with the British. So this is how the novel sees Armenians. And there's also another excerpt that describes how American missionaries would pick Armenian children, pure blood Armenian children. This is yet another novel from Müfide Ferittek, Pervaneler, another nationalistic and racist novelist. Sorry, let me go back to Yakup Kadri. This is another novel, Ankara. I think this excerpt is quite important because I think this was done by mistake. It is almost tantamount to confession. There is Ömer Efendi, and at the early days of the Great War, there is Veysel, a merchant, and then there is Hüseyin, who is a draper, and there is also one dresser. So this is the lowest segment of the society. These characters are from the lowest segment of the society, and in a way, the characters humiliate these people. Yet, all of a sudden, overnight, in the second year of the Great War, these lower classes get rich. Sodom and Gomorrah. Here in Sodom and Gomorrah, we also see misogyny. The novel portrays all women as if all women are up to sex. They are all the time chasing British officers, all the time running from one party after another. And we also see elements of homophobia. As I mentioned earlier on, Marlowe is a gay British officer, and he wanted to be bettered by dark-faced Turkish men in a wild way. And fire would cleanse out everything, says Jamil Kemal. So the fire of the war will cleanse out everything. There are also some other novels that we can look into. So Sodom and Gomorrah is a very good illustration of these examples, but there are some other examples too. For instance, this is another novel by Yakup Kadri Karaosmanoğlu. There is Arif Bey, a true patriot, and he's being blamed for his patriotism, and he is defending himself. He is loyal to the country and to the Sultan, and this country needs peace, and this nation is already fed up with what has been happening, and you have already ruined the country in the past 2 centuries, and now you also want to destroy whatever is left. And then we have Madame Elektrian, owner of a hotel. She is indeed a good character, so normally we would perhaps have the stereotype of portraying Muslims as good characters or non-Muslims as bad characters, but Madame Elektrian is a good character. This is how Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar sees Madame Elektrian. By the way, we don't see such coarse categorizations here in Kemal Tahir. And the grocer's property were seized by the Unionists, CUP members. But we don't really see such narrative in Yakup Kadri Karaosmanoğlu's novel. And beyond all that, there is yet another novel, Türker Armener's novel Hüküm, which takes place in Istanbul in 1920. And this novel makes us question who is the true traitor or who is the true hero. Well, by the way, when we look back into this list, we see that novelists kept writing novels that cover this period over an extensive period of time. So this was not really a periodical literature, and it actually spans over time. Thank you very much for your attention.
İkinci konuğumuz sosyal tarihçi, İzmir'den geliyor ve şimdi kendisi Konstantinopoliten gazetecilerden bahsedecek. Talat Ulusoy ismi, kendisi Mimari Fakültesinden, İstanbul Teknik Üniversitesi'nden 71 senesinde mezun olduktan sonra master derecesini Ege Üniversitesi
Architecture in the Faculty of Fine Arts, Ege University. He was a board member in Izmir branch of the Chamber of Architects between 1976 and 1980. He is also known to have established a civilian initiative in 2008, I'm sorry, called Yüzleşme Atölyesi, Atelier for Confrontation. And finally, his research interests include confrontation, memory, and Izmir urban history. Today, he will give us a lecture on the newspaper articles in Peyam of Ali Kemal Bey. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Bugün
Thank you. Today is the 5th of November, and Ali Kemal Bey today is very much alive. Maybe it is a divine coincidence, or maybe this was intentional on part of the Hrant Dink Foundation, but Ali Kemal Bey would die lynched in Izmir on the 6th of November, which is tomorrow. He was a good intellectual, a good writer, and a politician also. Since his youth, and since his days as a student, he was always involved in politics, in political struggle, and this is what defined him. And he doesn't come from an aristocratic family. He's very much self-made, and there are certain principles and values that he adheres to, and he is not someone who shies away from adhering to these principles. And today we will go back to 1918, November 1918, and some articles that he wrote back then. I'm going to share some excerpts with you to uncover some of the realities of the century that went before us, and we will embark on a journey, and hopefully we will forge new ties with the past thanks to this journey. Ali Kemal Bey now, I am not going to go into details of his resume, but and also if you wonder why this topic, I always think that his handwriting was so beautiful. That's why I wanted to choose this font. And if you have a difficult time reading it, it is because of the fact that some of the characters are not displayed properly. Now, Ali Kemal Bey experienced many interruptions. He was in prison, he was on exile. That's how he spent his life. And after his youth, when the war was over, for a short period, he was appointed as a minister. So he was someone who served in the realm of politics as well, in a much coveted position. Now, on the 14th of January 1919, Ali Kemal was the Secretary General of the Hürriyet Fırkası, and as you know also, Ali Kemal Bey and Hürriyet İtilaf Fırkası have been branded as traitors for centuries, and this label is enough on its own. No one really questions why these people were traitors. And I can say this for the majority, no one really bats an eyelid as to why these people were labeled as traitors. Now, Ali Kemal, he had some editorials published in this daily, and in pursuit of truth, there are four mentalities, and there is one thing that remains unchanged, which is labeling or stigmatizing people. that, and this is what I wanted to present you with during this talk. Ali Kemal Bey was someone who was for musabat, i.e. equality in Ottoman Turkish. And he was someone who advocated for equal coexistence of different communities, different faiths, and political persuasions. And this is quite unequivocal in his writings. And I will get to that. But what is at the opposite of this egalitarian approach, you might wonder. And that would be full independence, istiklal. And what is istiklal, you might wonder. And we will also see how memory afflicts us all when we deal with these concepts, and we become unable to question things and confront things. Now, in the Turkish Language Association, istiklal is described as, in modern Turkish, as liberation. And we know that words have a life of their own, and some people lead their lives, and certain things change over life, and as you age, you lose certain things and gain certain things, and you replace things as well, or one single word may be just killed off. And istiklal, the word istiklal, had this exact journey. Now, istiklal does not only mean liberation, actually. Now, this is the crux of the matter. Istiklal is liberation from the other, and 1901 dictionary of Sami Bey says that istiklal actually means deliverance from the other, or liberation from the other, or a man divorcing a wife can be expressed through this word, istiklal. Now, deliverance from liberation, from imperialism, and istiklal, and all these novels, these actually make us ask many questions. 4 mentalities, I said previously, and we talked about one of them, this idea or mentality of istiklal, liberation, and equality. And for 100 years there has been a battle between these concepts, and we have been engaged in this concept knowingly or unknowingly. And territory and community, that's another duality. And the word millet, which is very much in use today by a certain party or a certain segment of the society. And the third mentality would be, or the amalgamation of contrary concepts would be politics and power, the mentality based on politics and power. The fourth one would be justice and animosity. No, animosity and minorities. Now, because obviously when minorities were concerned, there was no justice to speak of, but through minorities, animosity was fueled for a long time, because adavet in Ottoman Turkish meant animosity. Now, these 4 mentalities, when it comes to Ali Kemal and his editorial articles, I'm going to try and also just bear in mind that 18, 19, and 20, these years, these concepts were very much in use. It wasn't just Ali Kemal Bey. Many people, Refi Cemat Alınay, who came back from exile, also focus on these concepts. He wrote for Milliyet Daily for years, and Refi Cevat was seen as someone who was regressive by the so-called intellectuals of the time. He came back from exile, from the Lausanne exile, and his articles, maybe it's like I mean, thanks to Abdul İpekçi, perhaps he was always featured in Milliyet, but younger generations, unfortunately, do not know much about him. So, apart from these four mentalities, still, in our day-to-day lives, we hear two contronyms, and these are still binding: a hero and traitor, right? And Ali Kemal Bey is a traitor, and as I said at the beginning, he was the Secretary General of a political party for a while. His political party was a traitor as well, and this has been a part of the official history of Turkey for a very long time. And this mentality of liberation, actually before the constitutional period, this was very much in use, and to the extent that I can not pinpoint a certain evidence, piece of evidence, but after the decree, constitutional decree, people wanted liberation and freedom, and the dominant nation, the Muslim nation, the intellectuals of the Muslim communities started using these words: istiklal, liberation, and musavat, equality, after the first constitutional period. And this is quite funny as well. There is only one constitutional period. 1876 was when it was announced, but this constitutional period, when it comes to those who wanted liberation, some people feared that the the enemy would benefit from equality. That's why it was suspended, the constitutional period, and it was reenacted in 1920. Again, it wasn't implemented properly, so there is no true constitution to speak of, constitutional period to speak of in Turkey. It was never fully in implementation. Let me skip this part. Now, the concept of liberation, you see an explanation of what this concept really means. Ali Kemal Bey, on the 16th of August 1919, wrote an article on why the English turned their faces against the Ottomans, and this article mentions many English intellectuals, members of House of Commons and House of Lords. There was this petition sent to the Sultan, and Ali Kemal, in his article, shares an excerpt from this petition by the members of the houses, and also the English are also traitors because they wanted a constitutional order in the Ottoman Empire, just like they had in the UK. And since then, these people so let me speed up a little. So yes, this letter, this petition signed by the members of House of Commons and Lords. So I'm also going to skip this part, says the speaker. Now, CUP actually prevented this letter from reaching the Sultan. Ali Kemal wanted this letter to reach the Sultan and thinks that it might mean something, but sadly he's proven wrong. Now, territory and millet, nation, this mentality. Millet actually means a religious community. It doesn't mean a nation. And similarly, istiklal means deliverance from the other, liberation from the other. It's not merely liberation. And millet doesn't mean nation in modern Turkish. That would be a miss. Now, millet is very much, the first meaning is actually a religious community. When you say the Greek community, you mean the Greek Orthodox community, right? And you do not mean the Hellenic nation. Now, Ali Kemal says we have many flaws, and we were able to capture territory, but we weren't able to administer them properly, he says in his articles. And what makes the motherland is the blood shed on it. And, you know, these are still lines of poetry that are recited by higher echelons of Turkish administrators. And this is something that we need to look at as a nation. Even at this day and age, we are plagued by this disease of worshipping a piece of territory. Now, politics and power. 5 more minutes. Now, in 1922, March 1922, the Greek kingdom forces troops called out to the Allied forces, and they wanted an armistice and they wanted peace talks. So Ali Kemal has some great lines. He says, minorities, Christians are a part of this homeland, and let's remember what the League of Nations has been doing, he says. And even now, today, these issues are unresolved in Turkey, and the importance of this is unrecognized in Turkey. So this is a mentality that has been on freeze for 100 years. And he was able to take a snapshot of this mentality 100 years ago. Now, since the beginning of the constitutional period, there have never been real elections, he said, and that holds very much true to this day. We've never had bona fide elections. 1950 elections, yes, some political parties were barred. There was censorship. There were bans, and in the absence, when you have censorship and bans, how can you talk about free and fair elections? Now, the Smyrna catastrophe is the culmination of the mistakes of the past, he said. But we see this as a Greek occupation, right? But our conquests are not disputable. They're always a good thing, but occupation is always a bad thing. So when you lose a war, you get occupied, and that's an awful thing. But Germany was occupied also, but there was no other politics than politics of power, or there is no politics, there is only power. So let me try and conclude. Mentality of minorities. We have seen this time and time again. We all know what happened to Hrant Dink, and this relationship between traitors and heroes. And yes, Izmir has a hero, and let me finish off with this. Hasan Tahsin is the hero, and Istanbul is a traitor, Ali Kemal. And they all had the same points of view. And this goes to show that those concepts are actually quite meaningless. I mean, CUP, Hasan Tahsin criticized CUP, but his statue is very much in place in Izmir at the Konak Square even today. Thank you.
Derdim çoktu ama
So I had a lot to get off my chest, but I had to be limited by my the time allocated to me. And we will be talking about the Great Fire in Smyrna tonight in Ipsos and Nurettin Pasha, right? So a bit of self-promotion. There is an upcoming event this evening if you're interested, and on Fridays at 7:30 p.m. I have this radio show called Smyrna Post. It's a bi-weekly show, so come and tune in and join us, please. Thank you.
Now our final intervention today is Professor Baki Tezcan's intervention on Halide Edip's newspaper articles during the Armistice period. I hope he's already in touch with us. Yes, okay. Professor Baki Tezcan received his bachelor degree in international relations from Bilkent University and in 1994. Then he completed his master's and PhD studies in Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. He is currently Associate Professor of History and Religious Studies at the University of California, Davis. He is also the president of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. He has published many articles on various topics related to Ottoman history, Ottoman and modern Turkish historiography, as well as Islam. Professor Tezcan, welcome. The floor is yours.
Çok teşekkür ederim.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me here, and I also would like to apologize for not physically be present with you. I prepared my speech in English, but I have sent the text to the interpreters beforehand, so I hope they will be able to follow my text as I read it. So let me start.
O vast, bloody grave of my countrymen, you are a humiliation, not only to the Turks who caused it, but to the whole human race. My soul lies in the very dust for shame of kinship with the race that murdered you, while it moans and weeps in pain and sorrow for you all. This quotation comes from the English translation of a piece Halide Edip apparently published very soon after the Adana massacre of April 1909, probably in Egypt, where she escaped to in the aftermath of the counter-revolution earlier that month. A somewhat modified version of this piece was going to appear in the daily Tanin on May 18, 1909. According to the English translation, in the original piece, she went on to say, "The 30,000 dead, the ruined land, the living country turned into a silent tomb, a murdered people of defenseless men, helpless women, innocent children, demand vengeance. If the murderers are not punished for those atrocities they have committed in the name of religion, the blood of our Armenian brethren will remain forever a red stain on the name of the young Turks." The version of this letter that was published in Tanin managed to reach, touch, and resonate with Ottoman Armenians, as indicated by at least 2 letters by 2 Armenian women that appeared in the Ottoman press later that month. This was not the first time that Halide acknowledged the violence perpetrated against Ottoman Armenians. In an earlier piece she published soon after the 1908 revolution, she suggested that Ottoman government officials participated in the murder of Armenian shopkeepers and merchants, mostly to annul their debts. 7 years after the Adana massacre, in 1916, she was going to publicly criticize the Armenian genocide in front of an audience of 700 attendees in a talk she gave at the Türk Ocağı, or the Turkish Hearth, the institutional headquarters of the Turkish nationalist movement in the early 20th century. There is no other Ottoman Turkish intellectual of note who had the courage to publicly acknowledge massacres of Ottoman Armenians and dare to criticize the genocide while it was still unfolding. Yet, as pointed out by Hülya Adak in several studies, Halide Edip's depiction of the violence perpetrated against Ottoman Armenians changed course in the late 1910s and the early 1920s. She gradually identified with the defensive Turkish nationalist narrative, to the development of which she made a major contribution in her novel, The Shirt of Flame. This presentation focuses on the articles Halide Edip published during the Armistice period with a view to chart the transformation of her stance in response to the occupation of Izmir by the Greek army and the occupation of Istanbul by the Allies. Just a few days before the beginning of the negotiations that were to lead to the Armistice of Mudros in late October 1918, Halide Edip published a long article entitled Wilson'ın Şartları Karşısında, or In the Presence of Wilsonian Principles, in the Daily Vakit. Behind the smoke of the ingenious and murderous guns of 1001 faces which the world invented to kill people in the most ghastly way, out of the innocent and martyr heads of its millions of human victims, there appeared for us the humanity's second declaration of human rights. Establishing a parallel between the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of the French Revolution and the Wilsonian principles, Halide Edip saw these principles as granting nations the kind of rights that, according to her, Jean-Jacques Rousseau granted to the individual. The dream of national independence, millet istiklali, was now within reach. In this piece, Halide Edip recognizes this right for the subject nations of the Ottoman Empire as well, and even wishes them well. Yet, at the same time, Halide Edip is afraid that in between the lines of the same principles, Turks appear to be the people whose rights should be limited because of the policy of oppression and extermination they pursued for their citizens who belong to a different religion than theirs. To her own rhetorical question of why, she responds in this way. In our last powerful days, supposedly as a service to the Turkish element, we deported and tried to annihilate the Christian, especially Armenian element, again with a medieval method. Halide Edip adds that because the Turks were the ruling and therefore responsible element, the whole burden and dishonor fell on the shoulders of the nation, even though those who actually turned the deportations into murder and catastrophe were just some murderers and robbers among the governors, government officials, and representatives. In response to the new Ottoman government's promise to bring Armenians back to their homes, Halide Edip states that the government's executive power in the provinces might not be enough for this. Therefore, she proposes that the government establish a commission consisting of Americans, Armenians, and some conscientious Turks who had stood with the Armenians during the war. She also demands a governmental declaration that protects the rights of forcefully converted Armenians to return to Christianity. While one might be justified in saying that Halide Edip was making these demands for partial governmental remedies to the deportation and Islamization of Armenians in order to have a better chance at the peace table, she reminds her readers that she made similar statements during the war. While this is difficult to verify, she indeed criticized the genocidal policies of the government at the Türk Ocağı, as I mentioned earlier. She's also on record for referring to Bahattin Shakir, the architect of the Armenian genocide, as a murderer in 1916. Even in this piece that takes responsibility for the crimes, however, there are 2 points of ambiguity. First, Halide Edip only assigns theoretical responsibility, nazari mesuliyet, for the young Turk leaders whom she calls idealist lovers of their nation, memleketlerini seven ve idealist. Ali Kemal would disagree with this, I imagine. She asserts that they might even be as sorry as she is today by the results of their actions, which was produced by their very primitive and awful understanding of nationalism. Milliyetperverliği çok iptidai ve fena anlayan, bugünkü neticeden belki benim kadar müteessir olan birkaç kuvvetli adam. Furthermore, she argues that the Germans undoubtedly share this theoretical responsibility as well. As for their punishment, she pleads for the postponement of their trials until such time that courts could be established in a humane and legal way after the excitement subsides. Ceza kısmının bütün heyecanlar dindiği, mahkemenin insani ve kanuni bir şekilde teşekkül ettiği zamana kalmasını talep ederim. Her close relationship with Kemal and Talat Pashas seems to have made it difficult for her publicly and unequivocally assign responsibility to them. Second, Halide Edip adds a footnote to her article which foreshadows her future shift to what came to be called the defensive Turkish nationalist narrative. I would like to state that I saw on official Russian documents that Armenians killed many Turks as a result of the desire for vengeance that came to inhabit the country because of this awful policy. The source of the miseries that befell Turks and Armenians and of the blood they shed mutually is the same. And in the future, I will dissect the damages and calamities that this awful policy inflicted upon the Turk one by one. The mutuality of the bloodshed was going to become a major pillar of the defensive nationalist narrative. Yet at this point, at the end of the World War and before the Allied occupation of Anatolia, Halide Edip's narrative acknowledges the centrality of the evil, the deportation policy unleashed, and presents the mutual bloodshed as a consequence of it. Yet at the same time, she is anxious to create a distance between her Turkish nation and the crimes perpetrated against Ottoman Armenians. I am of the opinion that I'm acting on behalf of my noble nation, which does not have blood on its hands, while I disclaim the murders perpetrated in the name of the Turkish nation by those who were unaccountable at a time when the Turkish nation was ruling and accountable. In November 1918, in a piece she wrote on Syria, Halide Edip is once again quite frank about the governmental responsibility for the Armenian genocide. And she utters 500,000 as the number of people who perished. But I will skip this piece in the presentation for the sake of time. The next piece in which she refers to Armenians is from January 1919. She introduces this article by explaining that the experts who came to Europe for the peace conference in the company of Woodrow Wilson deserve some attention. Among them, she refers to Albert Leibeyer and Herbert Adams Gibbons. She states that she tried to get access to the articles Gibbons published during the war and could not locate the one on Istanbul, which apparently was written in a friendly manner toward the Ottomans. Then she goes on to provide a summary translation of another piece by Gibbons entitled Europe and Islam. Gibbons' piece might be summarized by its concluding sentence, Islam wants friends, not masters, which Halide Edip modifies slightly to make it the headline of her translation, Muslims do not want masters for themselves but friends. She must have known Gibbons, who taught at Robert College in the 1910s and reported on the Ottoman Empire as a journalist, calling the Armenian genocide the blackest page of modern history in the title of a short book he published on the subject in 1916. Gibbons' Turkish summary translation by Halide Edip is not just any summary, though, but a quite telling one, as it exposes the issues that must have been most sensitive to her. Here is a paragraph that she chose to translate in full before her translation. So this paragraph you see on the left is the original published in the Century magazine. And then here is the same paragraph in her translation. I'm not going to read everything and compare them for the sake of time, but what is very clear here is I'm going to focus on this one sentence. This is what he wrote: a Syrian state in Syria, an Armenian state in Armenia, or Cilicia under the collective guarantee of all Europe, and the union of the Greek islands and the middle portion of the Asia Minor region littoral to Greece. This is the only program that will satisfy the aspirations of the subject Christians and nationalities and assure a durable peace in the Near East. If you look at the same sentence over here, you'll read it: in Syria, Syrian government, in Armenia, an Armenian government, and the cession of the Greek islands to Greece could assure a durable peace. Gone is the middle portion of Asia Minor region, littoral, etc., the Turks or the Muslim, and gone is also the aspirations of the subject Christian nationalities. In the aftermath of the occupation of Izmir by Greece in May 1919, Halide Edip gave speeches in 3 public rallies in Istanbul. In the published versions of her speeches, there are no references to Armenians other than a brief reference to the sins of our country, which she qualified as very small in comparison to the occupation of Izmir in her speech at the Fatih rally. The occupation of Anatolia and the resulting threat of cession of the middle portion of the Asia Minor region littoral to Greece had changed Halide Edip's evaluation of the magnitude of the crimes perpetrated against Ottoman Armenians. In these speeches, one also sees a very clear emphasis on Muslim identity that is supposed to naturally unite Turks with the rest of the Muslim world, a point to which I could return in the discussion if there is interest. In her first article after these rallies in June 1919, Halide Edip asked the Allied powers on behalf of the Turks, the Greeks have Greece, the Armenians Armenia, the Arabs Arabia, where is Turkey of the Turks? Who among these nations sacrificed most for their independence and honor? Help us, give us capital, give us ideas, give us friendship. The Turks deserve these as much as the Bulgarians, the Serbians, the Greeks.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Professor Tezcan. These are your last 5 minutes, okay?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. The Armenia Halide Edip refers to here was the Republic of Armenia that was outside Ottoman borders. Thus, neither the Greeks nor the Armenians in these sentences refer to Ottoman citizens. Halide Edip touches upon Armenian, Bulgarian, and Greek Ottomans in an article in which she publicly addressed the King Crane Commission in August 1919. And here, I'm just not going to read it all for the sake of time. As can be observed clearly in her writings touched upon so far, Halide Edip's admission of the genocidal crimes perpetrated against Ottoman Armenians by the CUP leadership during the World War in late 1918 shifted, especially after the occupation of Izmir, to a defense of the territorial integrity of a new Turkey. Using her own metaphor, it would, of course, be impossible to sell this rosy Turkey to either Ottoman Greeks or Ottoman Armenians who had most recently been badly hurt by the thorns of that very rose, which she was actually aware of. Now, here, what I mean is right here. As she was actually aware of, as she finished her open letter to the King Crane Commission by arguing that the only possibility of keeping Turkey united and lifting the conditions that prohibit all its constituent peoples from developing in harmony and peace together is through the mandate of a nation that does not have territorial ambitions in the Near East and is capable of building a modern machine of administration within a certain period, this fixed period. She thus demands a single Turkey and a single mandate. As the latter is addressed to the King Crane Commission, it is not difficult to guess which foreign country she has in mind. It is, of course, the United States. As evidence in the first article I touched upon earlier, Halide Edip engaged with the Wilsonian principles publicly. Even though she does not claim any leadership in her public writings, she appears to have been the leading figure of the effort that created the Wilsonian League or the Wilson Prensipleri Cemiyeti. In her memoirs, she distanced herself from this association because after the foundation of the Turkish Republic and the consolidation of Mustafa Kemal's uncontestable leadership in the mid-1920s, having been a supporter of a mandate regime became anathema. Thus, she summarized the activities of the association only passingly. The league started in December 1918 and died out completely in 2 months, she said. Halide Edip, however, seems to have continued working actively to secure an American mandate through most of 1919. A few days after she wrote the open letter to the King Crane Commission, she penned an appeal to the American people in English that she entrusted to Louis Edgar Brown, an American journalist who was going to observe the Sivas Congress of the Turkish Nationalist Resistance Movement in September as a semi-formal representative of the King Crane Commission. There is quite a bit of evidence suggesting that even Mustafa Kemal remained open to the idea of an American mandate for much longer than he would like to admit later when he wrote his well-known speech, the Nutuk. Yet, Woodrow Wilson never responded to Halide Edip or the Wilsonian League. He only supported a mandate over an Armenia that he created on a map. The U.S. Senate rejected this mandate on June 1st, 1920. On August 10, the Ottoman representatives signed the Treaty of Sèvres that, among other things, sanctioned both the annexation of the middle portion of the Asia Minor region littoral by Greece and the creation of Wilsonian Armenia, both of which came to be overturned by military operations led by the Turkish nationalist resistance. The nationalists utilized, among other things, the resources that had been prepared by the CUP in advance, as well as some of the CUP officers who had taken an active role in the Armenian genocide. Ottoman Armenians appeared in Halide Edip's newspaper articles only once in 1920. On January 12th, she published a piece on a speech Mustafa Kemal gave in Ankara that was reported in Istanbul newspapers the previous day. She pointed out that Mustafa Kemal was neither denying the calamity that befell on non-Muslims, especially Armenians, nor wishing such things to ever happen again. On the same day, Halide published this piece. The Ottoman Parliament reopened in Istanbul. In February, they issued the National Pact that eventually led to the occupation of Istanbul by the Allies on March 16,
Professor
1920.
Tezcan, last two sentences, please.
All right, then you know the rest of the story. She moves to Ankara. She's no longer writing about Armenians at all in her pieces. Instead, she writes The Shirt of Flame, where she pretty much actually admits kind of what she's doing, as Hülya Adak very kindly put out for us together. And this is very telling. So it's a national defensive narrative in the making that tells you why it is being made that way. All mankind put a black mark on our faces and spat at it. They, the victor's world, consider us not only as the assassins of the Armenians, but also as enemies of civilization, because we went into the war with the Germans, destroyers of civilization. I'll read from the very end. To suffer what we have suffered and to be able to throw ourselves into the voluntary martyrdom of our great war of independence, we needed first and most to be convinced and to believe in ourselves. So in a sense, in order to fight the war, we had to forget all the bad things that we did in the past, she says here. And so I finish by reminding ourselves of a question Taner Akçam had asked. What might have happened had the Allies accepted the importance of the National Pact and its territorial demands, had they recognized the sovereignty of the Ottoman state while demanding the prosecution of those guilty of war crimes in exchange? A similar question comes sort of a, not very clear, but some sort of a statement like that comes in Halide Edip's memoirs, where she says, well, had those two things have been avoided, there's the map of the Greater Armenia, the effort to create a Greater Armenia in Eastern Anatolia, and the occupation of Izmir, the history of the world today would have been different, she thought. Thank you very much for your patience, and sorry that I went over my time. Thank you.
Do you have a question? Now, I would like to impose on you a kind of, I wouldn't say it rule, but maybe a way of, yeah, just a second. If you want more questions, you will have to accept less coffee during the break, okay? Because we have only 20 minutes.
Teşekkürler. Türkçe yaptım, Türkçe sorayım. Engin Hoca'ya.
I have a question to Engin Kılıç. You have touched upon a number of novels and the nationalistic discourse reflected in these novels, but I'm curious about the context of the First World War. At that time, these novelists, considering the readers and other novelists, how they received these novels? Were these novels praised by the readership or other authors of the time, or were they criticized? How were they perceived and interpreted at that time?
Bir kaynağı almak isterim bu vesileyle. Erol Köroğlu. Birinci Dünya Savaşı ve Edebiyat doktor tezi buydu. O kitabı da var. Temel kaynak odur. Onun dışında valla...
Well, literature sociology is not something so strong here, so we don't really know what is the number of books that were published and how many readers did actually read these books, but there is a certain government support. For instance, during the Gallipoli campaign, the government sponsors actually take journalists to the war zone so that journalists can make reports about it. but we can't really say the exact number of readership for these novels. I would like to thank all panelists for their presentation. I also want to ask a question to Engin Kılıç, Adam, Sodom and Gomorrah. I actually really like this novel, and I also studied this novel for my master's studies. Meanwhile, you really didn't recommend this book. Actually, you said really very bad things about this novel. Şahan Şahnur Sessiz Ricat was another work of literature that I compared with Sodom and Gomorrah. That novel was about a stateless person who had to leave the Ottoman Empire as an Ottoman subject and had to live in Paris under significant hardships. So this state of being stateless, and it really also applies for those who did not really leave the Ottoman Empire, but who also stayed in Istanbul. So this creates some sort of anxiety, and I can also find some traces in Sodom and Gomorrah. But we can also see it. And there is also a lot of references to animals indeed. It's almost as if some of the characters are based on some animals. So have you also noticed that? On the other hand, yes, Sodom and Gomorrah is an analogy, and yes, there is a nationalistic narrative. Sexual infatuation, racism, also there is almost like this euphoric or orgasmic way of celebrating the Allied forces' entry into Istanbul. We can all say that, and there is this great sin committed by Turks. And they also believe that what Turks had to suffer now with this occupation is because of Turks' earlier great sins. So these are all some excerpts from the book. And I believe that Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed depicting as if all this calamity happened to Turks because Turks have committed this great sin. Do you have a specific question, asks the moderator? How would you interpret this collective crime in a way? Do you agree with my observations, by the way? First of all, if I don't remember it wrong, I think it was Fatih Alto who wrote a paper about the animals that were referred in the novel. And it really seems that there was a woman acting like a panther, or there was a man acting like another animal. So there is a lot of analogy of human beings and animals in the novel. So it seems like Sodom and Gomorrah was an exaggeration of these analogies. On the one hand, it tries to portray Necdet as a very nationalistic or patriotic protagonist, but almost to the extent that he is suffocating himself, and he is in a party, he opens the window, he wants to take some fresh air, and when having a look at the Istanbul panorama, he cites some excerpts from the Old Testament. I mean, it actually, like, the novelist killed the very own character in order to force to talk about these bad non-Muslim characters, because everything takes place, by the way, in a brothel. So what I'm trying to say is that the more you're politicized, the weaker your message gets, or the weaker your literature gets. This is my personal opinion. I think we have a problem about the historiography of the Armistice period overall. We can also see that during this conference. I'm a member of the organization committee of this conference. For instance, the police station movement or Mimi movement in Istanbul, we have not really heard about those, which gives us the impression that we have overcome this or we came to terms with this, but this is not the case. We still need to address this issue. If I'm not mistaken, Yakup Kadri Karaosmanoğlu wrote that book in 1928, and then we have Nutuk, the great Nutuk, whereby Mustafa Kemal Pasha he shares his understanding of the ideology. Actually, during those days, we had this Dolce Vita in Istanbul. In other words, there was this very big brothel, and Ottoman women would hang out with British officers. They would dance tangos. Meanwhile, dedicated Anatolians were preparing for the national struggle.
Microphone, please. So you might wonder why this is my reaction, and it's quite easy. There is a technical disruption with the microphone. We beg your pardon, but we cannot hear the speaker properly.
Karadeniz'den İnebolu'ya geçmişlerdir, oradan Ankara'ya gitmişlerdir. Yani Osmanlı ordusunun subayları olmasa o eratı yönetecek bir zabitan takımı olmazdı. Dakika bir, gol bir. Doğru. İki. Bir sürü
Now, in memoirs of many high-ranking officers, we see that these groups of resistance in Machka and in other storage areas, there were a lot of thefts, and these were sent off to İnebolu. These confiscated and stolen weapons were sent off to İnebolu. So a part of Ankara's needs for weapons actually came from Istanbul. We apologize, but we cannot hear the speaker properly. The microphone needs to be changed.
kendimi Ajda Pekkan gibi. 3. Hamit Hasancan diye bir adam var İstanbul.
This person called Amit Hasancan, and he's in charge of the Red Crescent in Istanbul. American. Again, we apologize. The microphone is not working properly. We will stop interpreting for the time being.
Tamam. Yani Amerika diplomatı Ankara'nın fikirlerini almak için mi görüşüyor? Bir ara bunun yazışmaları, daha doğrusu yazdığı Ankara'ya mektupların şeyleri müsvedde düştü sahaflara, bir kısmını okudu. Orada ilginç bir şey var. Mustafa Kemal Paşa direkt.
Önce bir eski arkadaşız diye sana torpil yapacak değilim.
Ayhan, please be brief. I'm not going to ask a question. If not, then come and join us on the stage. And also, the lady who took the floor before you, we should not upset her.
Yazdığı telgrafta şu var. Yollamış olduğunuz 6 ton çeltiyi sattım, parasını Osmanlı Bankası ile yolluyorum. Bir de para da gidiyor. Şimdi bu algı Nutuk'ta 27'de kuruluyor. 27'den sonra yazılan bütün mütareke ile ilgili romanlar bu sistemi tekrarlıyor. Maalesef tarih yazımda böyle. 27 öncesine bakarsa
Before 1927, perhaps we will have a better idea about the occupation in the novels and other literary works as well. Otherwise, it's like a template created first by Atatürk, and sorry for taking too much of your time. Thank you very much. My question is for Baki Tezcan. Ahmet Emin Yalman is a writer that I worked on, and at that time I saw a parallel, and I'd like to share this with you, and I'm wondering whether there are any other figures like him. Ahmet Emin, between 18 and 23, wrote 750 articles, and I looked at the concept of the other, and at the end of the 60s he wrote his memoirs, and there are two things that are in oblivion, I think. One is about the Armenians, and on the 16th of March 1920, Need for Politics 2 is the title of his article, and he says that, giving a piece of land to the Armenians in the east would be reasonable, and he cites the example of Crete, and he says, the Ottomans suffered a great deal to retain a strip of land in Crete, he says. And he talks about mandate, the whole issue of mandate, and how this is needed. And he uses an analogy as well. But these two issues in his memoirs are not present. So I'm thinking whether there is any such trend. That is my question to you. Baki Bey, were you able to follow the question? Yes, but I was not able to unmute myself. I think the host could do it, but now my mic is unmuted. So anyway, thank you for this question. Let me say this first of all, and also, as I said previously, actually, when it comes to the 19th, I'm not someone who focuses on the 19th and 20th centuries. I focus on the 16th and 17th centuries, but over the course of last 2 years, I read certain things about Halide Edip, because the association that I chair had this internal issue that we were debating, so I had to read a lot about Halide Edip, and that's why I wanted to be a part of this. And the reason I said that is because, and maybe I overlooked what you did because of this, because I cannot see you at the minute, but if you could please send me an email at my work email address, I'd be very happy, because just like you said, Ahmet Emin, they worked together within the Wilson Principles Society, and in their documents, Ahmet Emin also put his signature. So he, just like Halide Edip, he thought the same thing, and actually very openly they say, in the English version, they say that, here's what they said. Let me read it out to you. It's right here. I kept it on my desktop just in case.
The problem of the heterogeneous religions and races in Turkey. By doing this, America would bring peace and new life to a sorely vexed and distressed nation. Yani açıkçası.
So in quite openly, they say quite openly that Ottoman Empire couldn't do it well, and it ended up in despotism, so America should lead the way for the Ottoman Empire. And Ahmet Emin signed this document, and he, during the occupation, he also wrote articles about this, just like Halide Edip, but then things changed, and this idea of mandate became an accusation, a grave accusation, and Halide Edip stopped talking about this. It's as if other people founded the society, and they were just bystanders. And Ali Kemal, by the way, was involved in this society as well, and Halit Rıfkı as well was a member of this society as well. So Ali Kemal and Halide Edip got together within this society, but then, of course, there was a divergence right after the occupation of Istanbul, because Halide Edip moved to Ankara. So that question is an interesting one, the question asked by Taner Akçam, whether if things had changed, what would happen if the Allied, what might have happened had the Allied allies accepted the importance of the national pact and its territorial demands. And obviously, it's not possible to go back in time and say what might have happened, but nevertheless, it's good to have this debate. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before we move on to the questions, I'd like to add something. What Taner Akçam said, and actually yesterday Vahet Taşçıyan also emphasized the importance of this. Artin Boşgezenyan, people like Artin Boşgezenyan were forgotten, and this is the reason why, I think. And it's not all about punishing the murderers or putting them on trial. It was never going to be like that. Thanks to that, things would be restructured from scratch and wounds would be dressed. So yes, Artin Boşgezenyan and people who were against Taşnak Sütyun, whose past was based on İttihat-ı Anasır tradition, and that's why they were elected as an MP from CUP, and that has to be recognized as well. So yes, please.
CUP member saved his own family is understandable, and we should not decontextualize his actions for a nice argument, which is the same thing with Halil Edip. Halil Edip, at the end of 1918, wrote to Cemal Pasha, it would be a stupidity to leave behind the Armenian children I Turkified basically Halil Edip, at Aintura, whose parents we have killed, it's in the document, and let them fall into the hand of the Allies. This was published in an article of mine here with the Mardin proceedings. So I see Halil Edip in no way changing our argument at all. I think the acid test of her policies is not her writing about solutions for the Ottoman Empire, but what to do with Armenian children. And there she never ever changed her stand. Armenian children were Turkish children they had taken, and she was doing everything she could to prevent the return of these Armenian children. At the time, she was talking about Wilson. So this is a comment. I apologize for that, Professor Tezcan. And it's very interesting, the material you put together. For me, as an historian, I focus on the children and their fate. So how did she write in your material? How would you fit in this issue of the children, which I see as a contradiction?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. I did not touch upon the Aintura orphanage at all during this talk. I feel the experience of the orphanage could use just a bit of nuance than it has been getting, but I'm aware of the document that you referred to. I think I remember reading it somewhere else. Maybe he was referring to you. I'm very sorry. I think I remember reading in Selim Deringil's article a reference to a document in which she also made a similar thing about transfer of the children. But at the end, when actually she left Syria, as far as I understand, she entrusted all the children, Armenian children, to, I believe, American missionaries. So she didn't really follow up on that thought of taking the children to Anatolia. She stopped. And another thing, in her writings where she talks about the Aintura orphanage in her memoirs, of course, it's difficult. First of all, we should understand the memoirs, she's writing them some years later. So how much of it is she trying to clear herself? How much of it is sincere is very difficult to decide. But in the memoirs, she appears to have being very sort of uneasy about taking on the orphanage. That is what she says. She told a lot about taking that additional responsibility. In the contemporary writings, when people talk about her work in Syria, and there are a couple of articles in 1917 in the Turkish press while the war was going on about her work in Syria, the orphanage doesn't come up. What comes up is the main work she was doing, which is establishing girls' schools. The plan was to establish some women's teachers' schools that would educate the teachers who would then go and teach Syrian children. And in that context, she opened a school in Beirut, a school in Damascus, I understand, and various things. That is what is getting a lot of attention. The orphanage doesn't come up, but in one of her own writings, she does refer to the orphanage right after the war, and there she puts it as the children really needed help, and I just took it. I had to take it because she makes a visit first. Before she takes on the job, she actually has a visit. And so she has an experience of what is going on. And interestingly, if you compare her memoirs with the memoirs of a survivor who actually was in that orphanage and survived the years of the First World War and then grew up in Beirut, that memoir is available both in Turkish and in English. In that memoir, you do see that there comes a new director to make things a little better for the children soon after Halide Edip is appointed as an inspector. And if you look at Halide Edip's memoirs, you see that Halide Edip fires the director who was at the orphanage before she arrived as an inspector and hires a new person. And with the new person, apparently beatings, falaka, stops. So in a sense, she doesn't say the children were not Islamized. She actually accepts that that was happening. But in one conversation with an American missionary, she says, well, you know, they're children, they need food and support right now. And then later in another conversation, I think they'll know what their religion is later or something like that. She belittles the issue of the religion and focuses on sort of feeding the children. And it does use her connections with the finance minister to get more resources to the orphanage. And if you remember the situation in Syria at the time, there was a famine going on, partially because the army was there, but other things intervened. People were dying from hunger. So under those conditions, her appointment as an inspector and her use of her relationships with governmental officers to increase the resources given to the orphanage does increase the survival chances of the kids who live there. So to me, she might have sort of sat and asked herself, what is more important, the survival of the children or in what religion they are? And it looks like she made a calculation like that and took the job that way. And then you're right, she does write that we need to take these children back, but at the end she doesn't. The children are left to the American missionaries as she leaves the town. So it's a complicated question. I don't have a very clear answer. It is definitely something that is very uneasy for her and also difficult to explain. İpek Çalışlar, who wrote the biography of Halide Edip, is of the opinion that she was very critical of the policies. She did it unwillingly just for the help. Other scholars are not giving her as much credit. And I'm afraid I cannot exactly tell where we should stand, but her appointments, her acceptance of that appointment does increase the chances of survival for the children there indeed.
Teşekkürler. İsmim Ozan Ceyhan.
Thank you very much. Ozan Ceyhan is my name. Engin, I have a question for you. Thank you for your talk. And I studied the perception of Charles Darwin in the late Ottoman period between 11 and 14 when it comes to evolution and Darwin. People said we were weakened by the Balkan Wars, and we see a lot of reference of that, but not in literature, and that was surprising for me. And you said that the occupation, building of a new identity, it was a good opportunity to build a new identity, so it was more probable for that to be have been used in literature. So I'm thinking in the run-up to 22, there was this uninterrupted period of war and Balkan Wars, and what happened afterwards, or in comparison with what happened afterwards, the Balkan Wars faded in magnitude. So, I mean, why is the Balkan Wars not really featured in literature? Is my question. Just as an additional remark, in my you talked about theology in the previous talk, and teleology, not theology. Teleology. And what would you like to say about this? Please let us hear from you about your point of view about this, because the Balkan Wars has no revenge, right? No reprisal. So what you said is quite correct, because in the memoirs, people always say we've been in war for the last 11, 12 years. So that was my addition. What would you like to say? One more thing, please. Is this an addition as well? '93 war, as far as its implications are concerned, is actually much more important, quote unquote. Do we see traces of that war in literature? No, there was no literature to speak of at that time. I mean, there was only Ahmet Mithat, and his works are literary works is another matter of debate. I mean, Balkan Wars and literature is actually what I focused on for my PhD thesis. And yes, Balkan Wars were not featured in literature, but there were utopias. I mean, there were utopias that were written about in 1913. There was this utopic trend. We're coming to the end. There's this point of no return. What are we to do? How are we going to exist? How are we going to keep on going? Is what people wrote about. And when you look at what people wrote about, there are certain emerging themes. Right before the war, for instance, there's this belittling the enemy, and I call this imperial blindness. I mean, the head of general staff quashed the rebellion in Yemen, and there's a lot of arrogance. And he tells the high-ranking military officers, in addition to your uniforms, get your ceremonial garb as well, because for celebrations that will be necessary. And then there's defeat, crushing defeat. It's a huge shock. And then there's this need for a savior. I mean, who is going to save us? That's the sentiment. Who is that hero that we desperately need? And also there's this issue of hatred, animosity, revenge, and so yes, there are all these trends. We need to seek revenge. There's hatred. All these sentiments are very much rampant. And the remembrance in '93 war, we experienced this as well, but we forgot. So the same thing is happening all over again. So we need to remember this. That's another theme that's quite prominent at the time. And also, one more thing that's quite interesting, a bit schizophrenic, this love and hate relationship for the enemy. The Bulgarians, we need to kill them. They caused our ruin, but they beat us. So we need to be like them if we want to beat them, right? Yes, or like this need for a national ideal. We need to have a national ideal, otherwise we will not be able to succeed. And there is no word for ideal in Turkey, and mefkure is coined as a new word, and so on and so forth. And then another dimension is, that people think that it's literature that has to do that has to do this. So if there had been Twitter or Facebook at that time, maybe or maybe Twitch had been available, then there wouldn't have been need for literature, but literature was the only tool. And also this shift is very interesting. I think there's a reconciliation there. That channel is blocked. I mean, there's population exchange with the Bulgarians, and there's an even graver problem 1 year later. So here's my interpretation: the essence or the reaction is there, but the target is changed. I mean, it will be directed towards Armenians during the genocide, and then it will turn into xenophobia, and then the Balkan trauma will be. I mean, directed to other outlets. I think that is my interpretation. One final word, please, and then we will have to conclude the session. Thank you for your presentations, and maybe this is a bit off topic, but Nazım Hikmet has this poem on the independence war, and there he presents a point of view and not just talks about the heroes and the leaders, but also members of the public like Kartallı Kazım and when he talks about being on a ship and this character called Ilyas, I mean, all these wonderful stories, all these narratives, and I think that is a great point of view, a different point of view. And at that time, socialism and the Soviet revolution had taken place, and it had implications here as well on the Turkish intelligentsia, and we should not forget that. I just wanted to share this with you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes. Nazım Hikmet, in his poetry, talks about Ali Kemal, him being mob lynched in Izmit, and when you read it from start to finish, portraits, human portraits from my homeland, you don't understand whether he condemns this lynching or not. And what is more grave, there's a line in that poem, millet, nation has heard, and people are rebellious, they're coming. He says, so lynching it does not belong to masses. I mean, it's just one single person and a handful of people lynching one person, and just like the lynching of Hristovos in Izmit, Ali Kemal was lynched, and Nazım, I mean, yes, he may have been a communist or whatnot. I mean, he represented the point of view of intellectuals at the time. I mean, he thought too that these people were traitors. I mean, that's my interpretation. Yes, Orhan Şahi, Gökyay, I had a line, and you referenced that, and Nazım Hikmet has a line as well, a couple of lines that I'm sure you know about the Suez War. In 56, the Egyptians are told that, you know, if you do not shed your blood, it will not be a homeland, he said in his poem. So nationalism was actually very much present in his mindset. Yes, thank you so much, everyone. The session is adjourned.